The HOA president stormed onto my land the day I arrived, demanding I surrender the lakefront portion of my property. She claimed it belonged to the neighborhood based on a supposed verbal arrangement with the previous owner. She flat out refused to believe I legally owned the land and warned me she could make my life miserable. What she didn't know was this wasn't just some simple cabin, and I wasn't about to back down. Things were about to escalate fast. What do you think I should do next? Drop your thoughts in the comments. After nearly 2 decades of 18-hour workdays, building my software company from the ground up, surviving 3 rounds of funding, and countless nights on an office couch, I finally arrived at my dream, a secluded cabin on the lake. That first morning, I held my coffee close, soaking in the silence. It was surreal. After years of urban noise and constant digital overload, the quiet felt deafening. For the first time in forever, I could actually hear my own heartbeat. The lake radiated a sense of peace. The real estate agent called it a hidden gem, and as I watched the golden light shimmer across the water, I understood why. No honking horns, no nonstop meetings, no phone vibrating every few minutes. Just me, nature, and the home I could finally call mine after years of cramped apartments and mortgage stress. For once, I thought I might sleep through the night without waking up in a panic over client calls or server outages. That peace lasted all of 30 minutes. Then I heard it, heels crunching the gravel like a warning bell. I looked up. A sharply dressed woman in a business suit, wildly out of place in the woods, was approaching with unmistakable authority. Her movement screamed entitlement, like she already owned the place. The wind blew through her hair, but she was too focused to notice. Her eyes were cold, her stride confident, and I should have locked the door right then. Her clipboard and neatly tucked stack of what looked like legal papers gave off a deliberately intimidating vibe. She didn't knock, didn't introduce herself. She simply began visually dissecting my property, my dock, my shoreline, my home like she was appraising it for seizure. When she finally spoke, her tone made it clear this wasn't a casual introduction. I'm Laura Kent, president of the Willow Lake HOA. We're responsible for maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetics. Her smile was tight and forced, her eyes scanning my cabin with poorly concealed disapproval. You must be new. We have a standard of living we expect everyone to follow. She unfurled a hand-drawn map that looked more like a child's project than a legal document, pointing to my lakefront area as if presenting key evidence. This section has always been community space, she said, tapping the paper like she was staking a claim. The previous owner agreed to it. I kept calm barely. Inside, I was boiling. She had just stepped onto my land and was trying to convince me I didn't own it. I calmly asked to see documentation of this so-called agreement. Instead, I pulled out my official deed and survey map, both clearly stamped and legally binding. I laid them out on my deck table like I was playing a royal flush. Everything to the waterline belongs to me, I said. She glanced at the documents, dismissed them instantly, and continued arguing about some verbal agreement with the former owner. Man named Walker. Her tone changed when she mentioned him, and her eyes darted away for just a second. It sounded less like confidence and more like desperation. Walker understood how things worked here, she insisted, her voice cracking. There was something off about how she clung to his name, as if saying it enough times would make my deed vanish. She sounded like someone grasping at a fantasy agreement that probably never existed. It made my skin crawl. Before I could challenge her further, she flipped back into intimidation mode with unsettling ease. The HOA board will address this, she said with fake authority. You'll learn the rules soon enough, Mr. Reed. The way she said my name felt like a threat. She glanced back at my home as she walked off, as if she expected someone to confront her. Her parting words chilled me. We need to talk about your property. I hope you'll be cooperative. As her car vanished down my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling I had just become a pawn in someone else's game. It felt rehearsed, like I'd unknowingly stepped into a script. I sat back down, coffee in hand, but the morning's serenity was gone. And I had a gut feeling things were about to get much worse. The next day confirmed it. A thick stack of HOA violation notices awaited me when I got back from the grocery store, each one more absurd than the last. My red doormat, which I chose because it reminded me of autumn leaves, was labeled a non-approved color under Section 12.4. Fine, $50. Due in 10 days. I had to reread it to believe it. A doormat? Who cared what color it was? But it was just the start. The following morning, another violation. My grass was allegedly half an inch too long. $75 fine. Apparently, Laura had been out there measuring it with a ruler. Then came a $100 citation for my wind chimes, which apparently breached noise policies despite being barely audible. I went from confused to furious. This was no misunderstanding. It was a calculated campaign to break me down. So I responded the only way I knew how, like a software engineer debugging messy code. I logged everything: photos, timestamps, GPS, coordinates. I created a spreadsheet tracking each violation, treating it like evidence in a legal case. Soon, patterns emerged. Laura's rule enforcement wasn't random. It was personal. That's when I decided to do some investigating of my own. I walked the neighborhood with a camera, documenting every violation I could find. Laura's own house was the jackpot. An oversized political sign, unapproved fencing, her dog roaming without a leash. I documented everything. Ironically, the HOA president was the biggest offender. While compiling my evidence, I met Tim, my neighbor. He looked up from his garden, nervous, eyes darting like he feared being fined for breathing wrong. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. Charles Walker, the guy who owned your cabin? He had problems with Lavra, too. There was a wait to. His words. Tim glanced around and leaned in. She made his life hell, always after his land. Before he passed, he said she'd regret it one day, said he was working on something big, called it his masterpiece. The way Tim nodded toward my cabin sent chills through me. I spent that night researching Walker. Turns out he was known for pranks that doubled as morality plays. He once designed a city hall fountain that soaked corrupt officials mid-press conference. His obituary mentioned he was perfecting one final project before he died. Suddenly, I saw my cabin differently. Maybe this wasn't just a home. Maybe it was a trap, but not for me. The next day, I got a certified letter summoning me to a disciplinary hearing. Laura's signature was at the bottom, but something odd caught my eye. The HOA letterhead still had Walker's old address, scribbled out and replaced in Laura's handwriting. A strange symbol next to it looked eerily familiar. It hit me like lightning. Lavra wasn't just enforcing rules. She was trying to take something from me. And Walker's plan? It might be playing out right now, through me. The hearing was in Laura's dining room, set up like some suburban courtroom drama. She sat at the head like a judge. 3 board members, clearly her friends, looked surprised when I walked in, with folders full of organized evidence. This was meant to intimidate. They expected me to fold. But I was used to boardrooms, lawyers, high-stakes negotiations. This was nothing. I opened by stating, I'll be recording this meeting per Section 4.7 of the HOA bylaws. Lavra tried to object, but I quoted the rule. The energy shifted instantly. I laid out my deed, survey maps, and title insurance. Ironclad. Proof. The board barely looked. Then I brought out photos of Laura's own violations, complete with timestamps and GPS data. One board member stared at a picture of her political sign like he was seeing her for the first time. Still, they voted unanimously against me. Lavra announced a $1,500 fine plus $100 daily penalties until I complied. Her smile said she thought she'd won, but then she made her biggest mistake. "Mr. Reed has 30 days to pay, or we place a lien on the property," she said. The room fell silent. That wasn't enforcement. That was theft in disguise. And I knew right then she'd crossed a line that would destroy her in court. One board member shifted uncomfortably and finally said, "Lavra, maybe we should reconsider the lien. This was now federal law enforcement territory, and she was completely out of her league. I placed my documents down, each one as uncheckable as the earth beneath us. But as the board reviewed them, it was as if I were invisible. Their dismissive glances confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about bylaws, it was about control. My battle wasn't just legal. It was against something deeper, more insidious. Federal environmental violations carry automatic fines of up to $10,000 per day. The contractors dropped their tools the moment they heard that number. Without the required permits, which they now knew didn't exist, they refused to continue, backing away from the fence posts like they were toxic. Laura tried to hold on to her authority, but her voice trembled. Her entire illegal scheme was falling apart in front of half the neighborhood. "I'm the HOA president," she kept shouting, as if that title could magically override federal law. The sheriff handed her a trespass citation. The building inspector called for an immediate work stoppage, and the surveyor confirmed the fence posts were illegally installed on protected land. The contractors demanded compensation for their wasted time and refused to remove the posts without further payment, leaving Laura stuck paying double for her failed attempt. As I presented each piece of evidence, I noticed the fear flickering in Laura's eyes, though her smile never faltered. She was still playing her game of intimidation. The board was her performance stage, and she knew how to control the scene. But not this time. Public embarrassment was Walker's final touch to his master plan, and it delivered exactly what we needed. Neighbors who had long been bullied by Laura stood watching her authority collapse in real time. It was like seeing the Wizard of Oz unmask Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman previously targeted by Laura's baseless fines, leaned in and whispered, "First time I've seen someone put her in her place." Lavra had to pay the contractors out of pocket to remove the illegal fence. As she turned to leave in defeat, she looked back at me, fury etched across her face. "You have no idea what you're getting involved in, Reed," she hissed, voice raw with rage and panic. But I was beginning to see exactly what I was tangled in, and it was glorious. The board voted unanimously against her. "I lost," she muttered, and the chill that ran through me said this wasn't the end. It was only the start of something much bigger. As she retreated, I couldn't help but wonder, was this the finale of Walker's plan or merely the opening act? Clara and I drafted a comprehensive letter detailing Laura's illegal land grab scheme. We included photos of the damage, copies of conservation paperwork, and a timeline of her harassment that read like a legal indictment. We didn't stop there. We added documentation of her personal HOA violations and revealed her family's financial interests in seizing my property. We exposed her corruption in terms no one could ignore. That night, I pored over every document, the weight of the fight pressing heavily on me. Each file was a reminder that my sanctuary had become a war zone. My hands trembled as I prepared the packet, knowing that once it went out, the fight would go public. We delivered the letter to every home in the neighborhood. I felt like a revolutionary, distributing truth like contraband. But sometimes, the only way to stop a fire is to light your own. Lavra had used fear and manipulation to rule this community for years. It was time everyone saw who they'd really elected. and what she'd do to enrich herself. As I dug deeper, I uncovered her ties to a powerful inner circle residence with a vested interest in my land. It wasn't just Laura, it was a web of corruption. And every strand led back to something far larger than I expected. The community's reaction was swift and intense. Within hours of delivering the letter, my phone rang nonstop. Neighbors voiced outrage, and for the first time, they began sharing their own horror stories. Mrs. Patterson had been fined $200 for painting her mailbox yellow, a color that apparently clashed with community aesthetics. Mr. Rodriguez was forced to tear down his children's backyard playset because it disrupted architectural uniformity. Even though no one else could see it, once people began speaking openly, the pattern of abuse was undeniable. The calls kept coming well into the evening, each one pulling back another layer of Laura's tyranny. She had ruled through selective enforcement, arbitrary penalties, and personal vendettas. Residents shared shocking tales. Seniors fined over bird feeders for attracting wildlife. Families harassed over toys left in their yards for causing visual pollution. One neighbor told me Laura threatened a lien on their home because their garden gnome wasn't on the approved decoration list. Another family had to repaint their home 3 times due to subjective rejections. The truth was finally out. Laura's reign of fear was cracking, and the community was done staying silent. The colors were dismissed as clashing with community standards, even though they were clearly listed as acceptable in the HOA handbook. A retired school teacher told me Laura fined her for having too many books visible through the front window, calling it visual clutter that broke aesthetic regulations. The scale of her abuse was staggering, targeting seniors, families with kids, and anyone she thought wouldn't fight back. Suddenly, I understood why Walker had invested so much time crafting his trap. He had anticipated exactly what type of authoritarian would try to seize control of his land. Within 48 hours, the community called an emergency meeting. Laura tried to keep hold of the agenda, but as soon as she opened her mouth, residents seized control. For the first time in years, people realized she wasn't untouchable, and they weren't afraid to speak up. The community center overflowed with residents, finally ready to challenge her. Her attempts to regain order were drowned out by demands for answers and accountability regarding the illegal land grab. Someone had printed copies of my evidence and passed them around the room. Photos of Laura's own infractions and construction permits tied to her family's shady dealings. The dramatic confrontation was everything. Walker had hoped for a full-on collapse of Laura's power. Right before her entire kingdom, she tried to begin with a statement about maintaining standards, but was immediately cut off by questions about conservation violations and her personal interest in the Pavanwili land scheme. Clara stepped up with a clear timeline of Laura's misconduct while residents came forward to share their stories. Each one another nail in the coffin. 2 HOA board members publicly distanced themselves, saying, "We weren't aware of the easement or the family business link." This changes everything. Laura's empire was crumbling live and in color. Then came Mrs. Patterson. The elderly woman who had been tormented for years rose slowly, her hands shaking, but her voice steady. "I move that we remove Laura Kent from her role as HOA president, citing abuse of authority and unlawful conduct toward community members." The second came instantly from several voices in unison. It was thunderous. The vote? A crushing 23-1. Only Laura voted for herself. In one evening, she lost her title, faced potential legal charges, and watched her image implode across the neighborhood. Inside, I was torn between the peaceful retiree I had once been and the fighter I had become out of necessity. But Laura didn't bow out quietly. She spun out, unhinged like a trapped animal lashing at anything nearby. "You don't understand what you're destroying," she screamed. Charles Walker promised me access to that lakefront. That land is mine. That outburst was exactly what Tim and I had been waiting for. She had just confirmed that Walker had, indeed, said something to her about the land and she had taken the bait. The final trap was already snapping shut. I wasn't just going to reveal the truth. I was going to make sure no one in that town ever forgot it. If you were me, would you leave Laura to suffer in silence? Or finish the job? As I sealed one final envelope, a knock rattled my front door. I opened it to find Laura, eyes blazing. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Because you'll regret this." She turned and stormed off. As people began to leave the meeting, Laura cornered me again. Her stare wild, her words chilling. "You think this is over? You think Walker's final play was what you just saw? You don't even know the secret behind that little cabin of yours." She grinned, a deranged smile clinging to one last twisted hope. I wasn't sure if she was bluffing or if Walker had indeed left one last curveball hidden somewhere. But the manic certainty in her voice suggested she thought she was still in the game. And so, Laura called for one last emergency meeting. Her desperate last stand. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, disheveled, running on fumes, a shadow of the polished leader she once pretended to be. But that obsession, she clung to it like it was her last lifeline when really, it was the anchor pulling her under. My heart pounded as I entered the community center. Again, it was packed. But this time, it wasn't for Laura, it was for her funeral, figuratively speaking. Charles Walker told me that land would become community property after he passed. She shouted, trying to command the room. "Oliver, Reed is stealing from all of us. He's ruining our community for personal gain." Her voice cracked. She was clearly unraveling, trying to win sympathy that wasn't coming. The crowd didn't buy it. I stepped forward, the moment heavy on my shoulders, and locked eyes with her. "Laura, I have one question," I said calmly. "Did you ever wonder why Walker placed such a restrictive easement on my land? 8 years ago?" Each word was chosen. Every step of this had to be precise. I laid down the papers, one by one, watching the room's reactions build: shock, anger, realization. Laura's face shifted from confusion to dread. The implications hit her like cold dawn after a nightmare. "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "He promised me that waterfront for community development." But deep in her eyes, I could see the truth dawning. Her whole world was about to collapse. I leaned in. "You're right. Walker did plan for development. But you misunderstood everything." The room held its breath. That lakefront wasn't the goal, Laura. It was the bait. The silence was deafening. "Walker studied you. He knew you'd go for the most forbidden thing instead of the obvious answer." I unfolded Clara's annotated map. "While you wasted time trying to steal my protected land, you ignored Lot 7B, no environmental restrictions, full road access. Permits approved 8 years ago, and they expired 3 days ago." Laura's face drained of color. "All this time, your brother's company could have legally developed Lot 7B, but Walker knew you chased the forbidden fruit. You missed the real opportunity, blinded by your own greed." The trap had snapped. Shut. Laura had played herself. Walker had used her own nature against her, letting her write her own downfall. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I was the one in control. Laura looked around at the residents, board members, and neighbors she'd intimidated for years. I have to leave, don't I?" she whispered. Mrs. Patterson gave a solemn nod. "Yes, dear, you do." New leadership was chosen that night, fair, honest, committed to equality. Laura's dictatorship was finally over, not by vengeance, but by community action and well-earned justice. Back at my cabin, I read Walker's full letter, Greater Than Oliver, if you're reading. This Laura took the bait perfectly. Your cabin was never about the land. It was about choosing someone honest enough to set the trap in motion. Lavra moved out 2 weeks later. Her family's company went bankrupt. Her reputation? Burned to ash. Under new leadership, the neighborhood began to thrive. Fair rules, equal treatment, rising property values. Word spread this was a place run by good people now, not a petty tyrant. 3 months later, I sat on my deck, watching the still lake dot as the final meeting descended into chaos. People pointing and whispering about Laura, I felt a deep satisfaction. I turned to leave, caught one last glimpse of her. Her expression wasn't angry anymore. It was cold, calculating. "You've only won the first round," she whispered. "This isn't over." I raised a beer to the sunset. Charles Walker. Wherever you are, that was brilliance. You didn't just protect this cabin. You saved this whole community, a masterpiece. And sometimes, late at night when the lake is still, I swear I can hear Walker's laughter in the breeze, his final play still echoing in the wind dot. So, what do you think? Is the fight over? Or just getting started? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story hit home, show some love. Catch you in the next one. QA stories, where neighbors feud, secrets spill, and karma's always on time. Stick around. We brought receipts.